We're here in the Piazza dell'Orologio, the first major event on the Via Papalis after we made the fork in the road at the Zecca. As you noticed on the way down the street, we went from a street where we really couldn't see where we're going. The street slightly bent, and we really had no idea where we were being taken, effectively. We were following the road, but without any sense of where its destination was. Soon, though, as the road bent, we came into view of this tower, this clock tower put here in the middle of the 17th century. Now, it gave its name to this piazza, the Piazza dell'Orologio, the Piazza of the Clock. But it also is a significant event and tells us something about the ways in which people responded as architects and patrons to their position on the Via Papalis. The clock tower was built as part of the oratory, the Roman oratory that was founded by St. Filippo Neri around the same time that St. Ignatius was founding the Jesuits. Now, the oratory was built onto a church that was also founded by Filippo Neri. That was replacing an older church that faced essentially south. Its front door faced south. And that church and its orientation were essentially a given. They faced away from the Via Papalis, partly by an accident in a way. And Filippo Neri sustained that orientation of the church when he built his much grander new church, the Chiesa Nuova, the new church. When the oratory was built, inevitably its front door also found its way, oriented that way, away from the Via Papalis, and not on anything terribly important. In fact, it was on a rather small open space, but very little of a kind of urban context. Today, it's been radically transformed with, again, the building of the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, which fundamentally transformed this part of the center of Rome in the late 19th century to create a more consistent corridor for traffic. But when they built the clock tower for their oratory, the architect Francesco Borromini placed it back here towards the Via Papalis, essentially on the back side of the residential complex. The Oratorians are a group of both priest and lay brothers who live in community. And this clock tower was set over their residential quarters at really effectively the back of their building, but in a crucial spot on the Via Papalis, as we've seen, because it gives us something to focus on and target, if you like. Now, Borromini, who's a very inventive, creative architect, is also in response to both his context and the tradition of architecture in a kind of dialogue with other buildings. So one of the things he would have been referencing was that concave facade of the Zecca. So his clock tower isn't a simple shape. In fact, it also has that sort of concave shape that receives us. It has an image of the Madonna, and we'll talk about a little bit later why that Madonna image would be so familiar to people on a processional route or a pilgrim's route. The clock tower itself, the fact that it's a tower, is also significant because, as we said, coming down the Via Papalis in this stretch, we're in this kind of contentious zone of many private families, private interests, some of them very important, all of them sort of lobbying for attention and power in the city of Rome. And in the Middle Ages, they had really been outposts or bastions of powerful warring baronial families, often, again, in conflict, literal and physical conflict with each other. And like many Italian cities of the Middle Ages, especially in the early Middle Ages, these private families built towers, defensive towers that were essentially lookouts and retreat places to go in times of conflict and war. And those bristling towers that made the skyline of so many Italian cities in the Middle Ages were considered, when those cities became more stable and centrally governed, symbols of contentious and fractional private power. And so most cities had those towers taken down. Rome, like many cities in the Middle Ages, would have been bristling with towers, and only a handful of them remain. But most of them were taken down over the course of the latter part of the 14th and into the 15th century. Borromini is therefore building hard up against one of the most powerful families of the center of Rome, the Orsini's palace, in an area called Monte Giordano, which is really more even than a palace. It's really a whole precinct, a whole almost urban quarter, on a slight mound or rise for which it took its name, the Mount or Monte Giordano. The Orsini, therefore, are a significant presence in this neighborhood. And Borromini is, in a way, canceling out that private interest and that sense of private power with this public tower. It's a public amenity because it also provides a clock. And it provides a clock that would have been an important landmark for the city of Rome because very few public clocks were available in the center of Rome. In this day, in the 17th century, only a handful of people would have had clocks at home. No one would have had watches. And so knowing the time of day would have been a helpful thing for people in the neighborhood for a variety of reasons. And it's one of the few and a very prominent one existing on a very prominent spot in the city. Now, as a clock tower, too, it's also associated with the hours that regulate monastic life. And so for a religious community, they regulate their life according to specific moments of the day at which prayers are said. So they have a particular kind of rhythmic time. The clock tower is sort of abstract time, chronological time, time that's really independent of any specific significance. And as such, it's almost scientific. And it represents the fact that some of the Oratorians were very interested in scientific investigation, in mathematics and other forms of scientific knowledge. And so this is a sort of scientific time represented by this clock tower. The Madonna below it would have recalled the kinds of images of Madonna you would have found on many important streets in Rome. We'll talk about why some of them are oriented the way they are. But that would have been a significant thing that associates this thing with an important street. The fact that this tower is on an important street and has a Madonna suggests that this tower is also sacred. It's not just a public amenity, it's also part of the sacred realm of the street and the Via Papalis, and the sacred realm of the religious community behind. So in so many different ways, Borromini's reconciled the geometry of his plan of his building, the way it has to be oriented, but the ways in which it can also be multiply oriented, deal with and address different kinds of situations, both in terms of the architectural character and the presence of significant landmarks like the clock tower. So it's a highly responsive building, a very nimble building that has to deal with a number of different contexts. And so this possessor route, again, begins to shape experience, shape urban experience. Urban experience clusters around the route and responds to it in different and complex ways. Now, the route we're talking about is one that evolved over centuries. In a way, we're talking about a kind of an ideal possessor route that really represents its culmination after several centuries of building. So here we are, roughly 130 or 40 years after the Zecca had been built, and this significant landmark has enriched and clarified in many ways the experience of the possessor route. Because without this clock tower and without this piazza, we would have still been in that dense urban fabric of those warring baronial families and lacking any sense of orientation or destination. So not only did Borromini build the clock tower, but he's also responsible for the clearing of this piazza and the fact that that is also a public amenity. The private realm, the private palaces are all internally looking and defensive and inward. This public piazza is open. It provides light, it provides a kind of welcome relief on the possessor route, and it also provides a space for gathering and for people to do business, essentially. So it's a space that is, again, itself an amenity. Space in Rome is precious. In the heart of the abitato, any open space has real value because it's a kind of relief from that dense, compact, and often rather dark urban experience that exists elsewhere.